I'm Mr. MegaManFan, and you're looking at Junior Pac-Man for Atari 2600, also compatible with Atari 7800. Now, here's one to think about for a second. This was released in the late 1980s when Nintendo and Sega Master System were already on the market. His world is filled with gigantic mazes and nasty bullies. He eats more, runs more, and plays harder than Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man combined. He's impish, incorrigible, and independent, and it came out, according to this box, in 1988. But in reality, the release date was either late 86 or early 87. They just kept changing the copyright date every time they did another print run. But so far as I know, the red box and the red label are the only versions of Junior Pac-Man. The only difference being that the copyright date on it is changed from 87 to 88 on some of the labels. Let's join a playthrough of the game already in progress. And one thing you'll notice if you've ever played Junior Pac-Man in the arcade is that in this version, the maze scrolls vertically as opposed to horizontally. Probably due to hardware limitations of the Atari 2600. But if you really want to see what can be done if you do it the best way possible, there is an Atari 7800 Homebrew version that takes full advantage of a 7800's capabilities, created by Pac-Man Plus, or as I just like to call him, Bob. So look that one up if you want to see a more finessed version of Junior Pac-Man. But let's compare this to the previous Pac-Man video that I did and note some of the quality improvements over that game. First of all, Pac-Man Jr. actually looks like a Pac-Man instead of just a square that sort of resembles a Pac-Man. And when you move through the maze, his head actually turns and faces in the direction that you're munching the dots. So there are some quality of life improvements to the feel and gameplay as compared to what was, to be fair, the best faith effort that Todd Fry could make on Pac-Man at the time. This is a later release, so there are more programming tricks being used on the 2600 here compared to back then. And one of those tricks is that even though the ghost monsters do flicker, they don't flicker as much as they did on Pac-Man. And they aren't all the same color like in Pac-Man. These ghost monsters actually retain their individual colors instead of all being one shade of pink. So I would even go so far as to say the sound is quite excellent on Junior Pac-Man. The arcade feel of the ghosts being munched and the sound when the fruits start traveling. If you've never played Junior Pac-Man, that's another difference, is that the fruits don't stay in the center of the screen. They actually move around, and they change the shape of the dots if they travel over them. So Junior Pac-Man actually moves slower when he eats the dots that have been modified by the fruit. So you have to go out of your way to collect the fruit as soon as possible. Otherwise, you'll get too many big dots, and they'll slow you down too much and give the ghost monsters a better chance to eat you. So there is a lot of strategy along with some very fast gameplay. If you want to talk about high-speed action on an Atari 2600, I would say either Ms. Pac-Man or Junior Pac-Man or Asteroids or Centipede. Those are games that really get your reflexes up and going. You got to be moving at a quick pace. And the only way that I've really found to do it effectively is to actually use an Atari joypad controller like the 7800 Pro Pad that has two buttons, or an emulator that you can plug a USB NES style or Sega Genesis style pad into. Because if you try to do it with a stick, maybe this is just me getting old saying this, but a stick, you have to move it so fast that it actually, you can't even do it fast enough. Whereas the travel distance with your thumb on a D-pad is so much smaller that you can make the hairpin turns you need to stay one step ahead of the ghosts. They're right on your ass in this game. But one thing that is also true to Pac-Man, which you can't say about the Atari 2600 Pac-Man, is that you do gain on the ghosts going around turns, whereas I really don't think in Atari 2600 Pac-Man it made any difference. In Junior Pac-Man, it actually does. You can start to outrun the ghosts if you go around enough corners. Now, I've talked a lot already about the gameplay on Atari 2600, but if you're new to Junior Pac-Man, I also want to tell you a little bit about the history, because this game had a rather interesting past to become part of the Pac-Man legacy. By some accounts, not an official part, because it was developed by Bally-Midway without the authorization of Namco, which, like Baby Pac-Man and Pac-Man Plus before it, was grounds for Namco to terminate their relationship with Bally-Midway. They were not happy about these Pac-Man sequels being developed in the United States that they had nothing to do with. But I think, for what it's worth, they would have been well served to consider this an official part of their legacy, and maybe now in hindsight they do. I'm not quite sure where it stands these days, but there are changes that, even though this is originally running on a Pac-Man arcade cab, they make it so that it's its own game with its own feel. For example, the traveling fruits, which are now items like tricycles and kites, and the big dots that the fruits move over are worth 50 points instead of 10. And if the fruits run into an Energizer, it blows up the Energizer and makes it no longer available for Junior Pac-Man to use to turn the ghosts into eatable ghost monsters. And the intermissions are even different. They develop a relationship between Junior Pac-Man and a ghost named Yum Yum, who is apparently the daughter of Blinky, as we're supposed to believe that Junior Pac-Man is the son of Pac-Man Jr. Why they called him Junior Pac-Man instead of Pac-Man Jr., I'll never know. But all of these things just pissed off Namco to no end. And Ms. Pac-Man was actually the first unauthorized or bootleg variant of Pac-Man, but they sort of acquired that game through a deal with the creators. Boy, I can't think of their names off the top of my head. Let me go look really quick. Oh, General Computing Corporation. They made a mod kit for Pac-Man that turned it into Ms. Pac-Man. That was a company made by Doug McRae, John Tilco, and Kevin Curran. So there's a long history of Pac-Man derivatives stemming from the original Pac-Man. And in the arcade, Junior Pac-Man was always one of my favorites. Not more so than Ms. Pac-Man, but I really got a kick out of playing this whenever I could find an arcade that had it. Even though I would say the arcade version might, if anything, be harder than the Atari 2600 version. Even though this does move really fast, it's somewhat more forgiving in that you can, because it scrolls vertically instead of horizontally, you can kind of get a better idea for your relationship to the dots you have to clear and where the ghosts are. Whereas the horizontal scrolling maze is so big and there's so much area you have to cover and so many dots that you have to eat that clearing a maze like I just did there is incredibly hard to do. Not saying it isn't fun to try. I'll fire up MAME every now and then and take a whack at it with my arcade cab, and I can get through 2 or 3 boards in a decent session. If I'm really trucking, I can get more than that, but I would say that I'm more successful for the most part with this version than I am the arcade version. I don't know if that makes it better. I don't know that I would make that argument, but for the look, feel, sound, the fun that you can have playing Junior Pac-Man on the Atari 2600 or a 7800 when it's in 2600 mode, as they clearly advertised on the box for this game, I think it's worth a try. In fact, I would even say it's worth a try in emulation, whether or not you have the original cartridge and the original hardware. But it wouldn't be too hard to get both, because being this is only a Rarity 2 cart, you can probably find a copy at any pawn shop or thrift or flea that has Atari VCS 2600 games. I'm Mr. MegaManFan. Thank you for watching.